Okay, this is a quick little podcast lecture on comparative politics. What is comparative politics? So let's go through this. I'll just highlight a couple of things that you should have noticed in your reading. So there's been a lot of changes over the last couple of decades, rise of economic powers in Asia, etc., collapse of communism. So these are some of the things that we'll address. These are some of the substantive topics that we'll address in this course. So are these developments good or bad? How can we assess them? Well, in every chapter, O'Neill has a set of fundamental questions about that chapter. And so the fundamental questions in comparative politics, the questions that we'll sort of address in general this chapter are these. How can political systems be compared? What about the comparative method? I'll show you the comparative method in a bit. How do institutions shape politics in various countries? What are institutions and how do they work? How do different countries reconcile the ideas of freedom and equality, etc. Okay, so what is comparative politics? Well, this is an excerpt from the Lichtmach and Zuckerman reading, Neal and Rogowski, page 3. You notice, civil war, voting, ethnic conflict, policy interactions among bureaucrats, government agencies in Rome, religious bases of political action in these countries, democracy formation. So as they say, questions about the origins of capitalism. So, comparative politics, they say, therefore, asserts an ambitious scope of inquiry. No political phenomenon is foreign to it, and no level of analysis is relevant, and no time period beyond its reach. So it's a vast area or scope of inquiry in comparative politics. Okay. Let's go further. So what is comparative politics? Well, it's made up of two words. Politics, which is the second word first. And politics is simply the struggle for power that gives one or more persons the ability to make decisions for the larger group. That's right from page 3. There are various types of politics: office politics, locker room politics. Remember the whole Kobe Shaq conflict when they were both in LA. That's an example of locker room politics. But political scientists will focus on the struggle for leadership and power in the community. So that's what we'll focus on. In comparative, generally comparing, we'll use what's called the comparative method, which I'll show you in a bit. I'll go through that. Okay, so here's a couple of important things. So the comparative method is a way to make comparisons across cases and draw conclusions. It uses logic and evidence. Now, we look for, when we compare cases, we often look for patterns or what are called correlation. Now, correlation is simply an association between factors or variables, and I'll define those, what factors and variables are, in a second. But remember that correlation does not equal causation. Okay, and that what that means is that just because we see two phenomena, for instance, vary or relate in a particular way across countries or across time, doesn't necessarily mean that that there's a necessarily causal relationship between the two. In other words, we may see, for instance, economic growth and democracy correlate across countries in the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that one is causing the other, or vice versa. It could, in fact, mean that what we see is simply we simply see by chance, which is possible. It also could mean that that there's something else that's causing these two things to covary, which is a case of what's called spurious causation. So now, causation is difficult in social sciences, and just because we see things vary together doesn't necessarily mean that they're caused by each other, or that there's a causal relationship between the two, rather. So these are some of the reasons that that finding causations is difficult, according to O'Neill. I'll leave that for you. Okay. So there have been different approaches to the study of comparative politics. First was the traditional approach that we talked about, and that you wrote about in your response to the discussion board, and then which was superseded by what's called the behavioral revolution, which is a sort of a scientific approach to the analysis of social phenomena and political phenomena. That has been challenged most recently by a post-behavioralist approach, which essentially challenges and critiques the underlying sort of scientific pretensions of the behavioral revolution and its approach to the analysis of phenomena that deal with human beings. So traditional approach, we talked about this before. Behavioral approach, once again, the behavioral approach was dictated by sort of the idea that we could use science to analyze politics. Okay, the idea being that using something called the scientific method, which entails objectivity, the scientific method essentially comes down to observation, hypothesis, and testing. And so I'll show you what all those mean later. Okay, so an emphasis on scientific method means a shift from description, right? Remember this description means the questions, answering the questions who, where, what, and when, to understanding or studying phenomena from on the basis of causality, explanation, and prediction, which tries to answer the questions how and why. Okay. And we also place a greater emphasis on the behavior of individuals. Okay. Modernization theory, they talked about that in the text, so I won't belabor that. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so this is important right here. So there are competing traditions in comparative politics, and we'll look at a couple of them in depth, and we'll look at sort of rationalists and the rational choice approach, and then also culturalists later this week. So and then structuralists, which can be argued is not an independent or a competing tradition, but we'll sort of we'll leave this as a sort of a tripartite description. Okay, so as I said, we'll talk more about rationalists and culturalists when you read the Shepsbury and Bonchek, and then the Engelhardt readings later on this week. Okay, so now let's look at the qualitative versus quantitative divide. A couple of important when we try to test. Remember, go back here when we're talking about testing, hypothesis, testing, right there, observation, hypothesis, and testing. Observation and hypotheses can occur, and testing can occur at various in various ways, and the way the ways that they are done in comparative politics and in other social sciences is there's a division between qualitative and quantitative analysis. So when we ask the question, who's the better point guard, Jason Kidd, Steve Nash, I guess I could add now Chris Paul. Then what's your answer to that? Who's the better musical entertainer? Hilary Duff or Lindsay Lohan? Which country is more democratic, right? So when you think about your answers to these questions, then what is your evidence, right? How do you go about justifying your choice in each of these? Well, if you look at, for instance, this one, you would say, well, if any of you who know basketball, you would say, well, look at say assists per game, which is a good measure of a point guard's talent and ability. Others would say, well, what about points per game? What about shooting percentage? What about et cetera, et cetera? And still others would say, well, there's something about a point guard that makes his teammates better, or allows an offense to gel or whatever. And those are all sort of ways that you can go about justifying your choice. Now, if you think about it, there's a spelling error there. If you think about it, all those justifications are either qualitative or quantitative in nature, right? So these are the two sort of different ways of two methods of analysis, essentially, in comparative politics. One is the quantitative method, which is the gathering of statistical data, right? Emphasis on breadth over depth, and then the other is the qualitative method, in which there's the idea is to achieve a mastery of limited number of cases through a detailed study of their language, history, and culture. So in this as opposed to the quantitative method, emphasizes depth over breadth. Okay.